The sprawling, sun-scorched naval base in Coronado, California, was a crucible. It forged ordinary men into the extraordinary, the elite, the warriors known as the Navy SEALs. For those who aspired to wear the trident, this place was both a proving ground and a relentless dream crusher. The air, thick with the salt of the Pacific and the grit of the beach, vibrated with the constant guttural shouts of instructors and the rhythmic, labored breathing of men pushed beyond their limits. This was Hell Week, the final, brutal test of basic underwater demolition/SEAL training, BUD/S. And at its heart was a young woman named Maya, not an aspiring SEAL, but a highly respected psychologist attached to the training command. Her role was to observe, to assess the mental fortitude of the candidates, and to ensure the training, while brutal, remained within the bounds of safety and sanity. Today, however, her presence on the beach was about to become the focal point of a storm. Maya was no stranger to the intensity. She had spent years studying the psychology of high-performance individuals, from Olympic athletes to special operations soldiers. She understood the necessity of stress inoculation, the process of exposing candidates to overwhelming pressure to build the mental armor they would need in combat. She had watched hundreds of men quit, their bodies and minds surrendering to the cold, the exhaustion, and the psychological warfare of the instructors. She always maintained a professional, clinical detachment, her dark eyes observing, her notepad filling with observations about coping mechanisms and breaking points. But for one particular instructor, on a man named Senior Chief Petty Officer Miller, her presence was an intrusion. Miller was an old-school SEAL, a hulking man with a voice like crushed gravel and a belief system forged in the fires of the early 90s. To him, the modern sanitized military, with its emphasis on mental health and inclusion, was a threat to the very fabric of the SEAL teams. He saw Maya as the embodiment of that softness, an outsider who had no business on his beach. The candidates, a class of about 120 young men who had survived the first weeks of training, were in the midst of a particularly grueling surf passage. They huddled together in the frigid, waist-deep water, arms linked, teeth chattering as waves crashed over them. They were covered in sand, shivering uncontrollably, their faces masks of pure misery. The objective was simple: survive. Endure the cold. Endure the physical pain. And don't quit. Miller patrolled the waterline like a predator, his eyes scanning for any sign of weakness. He noticed Maya standing a respectful distance away, bundled in a thick Navy-issue jacket, her gaze fixed on the shivering mass of humanity. A slow, contemptuous smirk spread across his face. He saw an opportunity, a chance to prove a point, to expose the absurdity of the soft sciences in the face of true grit. He turned to a group of younger instructors standing nearby, just loud enough for Maya to overhear. "Look at that," he grunted, jerking his head in her direction. "The head doctor, out here to make sure none of the little darlings get a boo-boo." The other instructors chuckled nervously, unsure of where he was going. "You think she knows what this is?" Miller continued, his voice dripping with disdain. "This isn't a textbook. This isn't a case study. This is real. You either have it or you don't." He paused, letting his words hang in the cold air. Then he looked directly at Maya, his eyes full of a challenge. "Push her harder. She's nothing. She'd be gone in 5 minutes. Less." Maya felt the words like a physical slap. Heat rose to her cheeks, but she forced herself to remain still, her expression impassive. She had faced skepticism before, but this was a public, blatant challenge. Miller, seeing she hadn't fled, felt emboldened. He turned his full attention to her, his voice booming now, carrying over the crash of the waves. "You think your fancy degrees mean something here, ma'am? This is the grinder. This is reality. You don't have the first clue what these men are going through." He pointed a thick finger at the huddled candidates. "This is the price of admission to the greatest fighting force on Earth. It's not something you can analyze in a quiet office. It's something you feel in your bones. It breaks the weak and builds the strong. And with all due respect, ma'am, you're standing on the sidelines in a warm coat taking notes. You're not part of this. You couldn't be part of this." The other instructors shifted uncomfortably. The candidates in the water, despite their misery, were acutely aware of the drama unfolding on the beach. A tense silence fell, broken only by the rhythmic hiss of the surf. Miller stood there, chest out, a smug, victorious look on his face. He had drawn a line in the sand, and in his mind he had made his point. He had put the outsider in her place. Maya took a slow, deliberate breath. She had a choice. She could retreat, report his conduct to the commanding officer, and let the military justice system handle it. That would be the safe, professional thing to do. But as she looked at Miller's triumphant face, and then at the exhausted, freezing candidates in the water, a different feeling took hold. It wasn't just anger. It was a profound sense of injustice. His mockery wasn't just about her. It was about dismissing the very tools of resilience, of mental fortitude that she knew were just as critical as physical strength. He was living in the past, and his arrogance was a danger. She decided she wouldn't report him. She would do something far more effective. She would meet his challenge head-on. She stepped forward, her boots sinking slightly in the wet sand. She walked right up to Miller, stopping just a few feet from him. She was a foot shorter and 100 pounds lighter, but in that moment, she carried herself with a quiet authority that was unnerving. She spoke, not with anger, but with a calm, clear voice that cut through the wind. "You're right, Senior Chief." The words were unexpected, and Miller's smirk faltered. "I don't know what it feels like to be in that water. I don't know what it feels like to carry a 100-pound pack for 20 miles. That's your domain." She paused, letting the admission sink in. "But you're wrong about one thing. You think this is just about physical toughness. You think it's about how long a man can shiver. But that's only half the story. I'm not here to coddle them. I'm here to understand the other half. The half you can't see. The part that makes a man keep going when his body is screaming at him to stop." Miller opened his mouth to retort, but Maya held up a hand, a gesture of command that, for some reason, he obeyed. "You say I'm nothing. You say I wouldn't last 5 minutes. Maybe you're right. But your training, this test, it's not just about finding men who can survive the cold. It's about finding men with a certain mental makeup. Men who can process fear, manage pain, and lead under fire. That's what I study. That's what I understand. And that's every bit as real as the water you're standing in." Miller recovered his composure, his smirk returning. "Pretty words, Doc. But pretty words don't win wars. My methods do. I've been doing this for 20 years, and I know a quitter when I see one." He looked her up and down, at a clear dismissal. "This is my classroom. Maybe you should stick to yours." Maya nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Then let's make it a joint class." The statement hung in the air. "You want to prove I'm nothing? Give me a test. Let me get in the water with them. Let me experience your classroom. And then we'll talk about what you and I can each bring to it." A murmur went through the instructors. The candidates, who had been listening, were now fully alert, a flicker of something like hope or admiration in their exhausted eyes. No one, absolutely no one, had ever challenged an instructor during Hell Week like this. Miller was stunned. He hadn't expected this. He had expected her to crumble, to run to the CO. He looked into her eyes and saw not anger, but a resolute calm. It was the same look he saw in the best candidates just before they conquered an impossible obstacle. He was trapped by his own arrogance. If he said no, he would look like a bully who couldn't back up his words. If he said yes, he would have the smug satisfaction of watching her fail, spectacularly and publicly. "Fine," he growled, a dangerous glint in his eye. "You want a lesson? You'll get one. Welcome to the surf passage, Doc." He pointed to the water where the candidates huddled. Strip off the fancy jacket. Get in. You last an hour, and I'll listen to whatever you have to say. You quit. You get out of my training environment for good." Without a word, Maya unzipped her heavy jacket and handed it to a wide-eyed young instructor. Underneath, she wore a simple long-sleeved thermal shirt and a pair of running tights. It was utterly inadequate for the frigid Pacific in February. She kicked off her boots and walked towards the water. The cold hit her bare feet like 1,000 needles, but she didn't flinch. She waded in, the shock of the water stealing her breath as it climbed past her knees, her thighs, her waist. The candidates instinctively parted, creating a space for her. She linked arms with 2 of them, her teeth already chattering. "Don't mind me," she managed to say, her voice shaky but firm. "Just pretend I'm one of the guys." The first few minutes were a blur of pure, agonizing cold. It was a pain unlike anything she had ever felt. It wasn't sharp, it was a deep, penetrating, bone-aching numbness that clawed its way from her extremities to her core. Her body screamed at her to get out. Every instinct, every fiber of her being. I was telling her to flee from this hostile environment, but she focused on her breathing, just as she had advised countless soldiers to do in moments of panic. In through the nose, out through the mouth. She focused on the sensation of the 2 men's arms linked with hers, feeling their shivers, their shared misery. She was one of them now. Miller stood on the beach, arms crossed, a timer in his hand, waiting for the inevitable. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Maya's lips had turned blue, and her entire body was a quaking, uncontrollable mass. She couldn't feel her feet or her hands. The cold was a living thing, squeezing the life out of her. She began to lose track of time, her mind becoming foggy. She thought of her comfortable office, her warm apartment, her safe, predictable life. It felt like a distant memory, a dream from another person. Why was she doing this? The question echoed in her mind. She could quit. All she had to do was let go of the men's arms, walk back to the beach, and admit Miller was right. It would be so easy. The warmth of the shore was only 50 yards away. And then she remembered the mockery in his voice. "Push her harder! She's nothing!" She wasn't nothing. She was a woman with a purpose. And more importantly, she looked at the faces of the men around her. They were watching her, their own suffering momentarily forgotten. They were drawing strength from her presence. A woman, a soft psychologist, was in the water with them, enduring the same hell they were. If she could do it, so could they. A quiet, powerful current of shared resilience passed between them. The man on her right, a young enlisted sailor named Jones, he gave her a barely perceptible nod of encouragement. That nod was all she needed. 45 minutes, an hour. Miller stared at his stopwatch in disbelief. She was still in the water. Her face was ashen, her movements mechanical, but she was still there, her arms still linked with the candidates. He had never seen anything like it. The mockery had vanished from his face, replaced by a grudging, dawning respect. He finally waded into the water, the cold biting at his own legs. "Okay, Doc," he said, his voice losing its previous scorn. "You've made your point. Get out of the water, now." He and another instructor had to physically help her out. Her legs were so numb and uncoordinated. They wrapped her in thermal blankets, guiding her towards a waiting medic. As the warmth began to flood back into her body, bringing with it waves of excruciating pain, Maya looked up at Miller. He stood over her, his expression unreadable. He looked at the stopwatch in his hand, then back at her. 1 hour and 8 minutes. Finally he spoke, loud enough for the candidates on the beach and the instructors nearby to hear. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet, profound sincerity. "I was wrong." The words seemed to cost him a great deal. "Ma'am, I have seen some of the toughest men I know quit after 20 minutes in that water. You stayed for over an hour. You have more grit in your little finger than most of the men who've come through here. You are not nothing. You are something else." He looked out at the candidates being ushered from the water. "And you're right. It's not just about the physical. I've been breaking men down for 20 years. But I don't always know how to help them build themselves back up stronger. I see the ones who quit, but I don't always understand why the ones who stay, stay." He extended his hand to her. "Maybe it's time I learned. Maybe there's room for your classroom and mine." Maya, shivering but with a triumphant light in her eyes, took his hand. It was a handshake that signified more than a truce. It was the beginning of a new understanding. From that day on, the relationship between the instructors and the support staff at the BUD/S compound shifted. Miller became one of Maya's strongest advocates, incorporating her lessons on mental resilience, goal setting, and stress management into his own brutally effective training regimen. Maya, in turn, gained a level of respect and insight that no textbook could ever provide. She became a trusted presence on the beach, not an outsider, but an integral part of the team. The candidates who were there that day never forgot the lesson. It wasn't just about physical toughness. It was about the quiet, indomitable power of the human spirit, a power that could be found in anyone, regardless of their size, their gender, or their job title. And for Maya, the woman they once mocked, the icy waters of the Pacific became the forge that proved her own mettle. Not just as a psychologist, but as a warrior of the mind, a quiet equal among the elite.